And we're live. Late as usual, but I'm sure you're coming to expect that. We're just trying to prepare ourselves so that we have lots of interesting content to discuss in this next 45 minutes or so. So how are you doing, Glenn?
I'm good. How are you, Daryl?
I'm a little frazzled this week. It's been a week of deadlines that some of them are still pending, but we wouldn't want to miss out on doing the In the Mood for HTTP now, so priorities.
We would not. And I guess I'll jump in and say I've had a pretty exciting week. We actually now have a new CEO at Auth0, um, Eugenio, who was one of the original co-founders, and actually he's been somebody I've known for a long time. So I'm really excited for that.
You're gonna have to teach me how to pronounce his name one day. It's just one of those names that I look at and go, I'm just not saying it.
He just likes everybody to call him Eugenio. That's what he introduces himself as. So don't, just call him Eugenio. But I pride myself on trying to pronounce his name. And I don't
But
do a perfect job of it, but
he's definitely not new at the company, though. He's been around since the
no, he
beginning.
was him and Matthias were the original founders. Matthias Wolowski, who's our CTO. And I've, of course, known Eugenio and Matthias actually for a long time. It's one of the reasons I joined the company in the first place. And Eugenio is extremely passionate about customers, and it's great to have him at the helm of the company now.
Very, very cool. Very cool. So I'd like to start with a little rant.
You ranting, Daryl?
Yes.
This is very unbecoming of you.
Yeah, yes.
What happened that made you decide today that you was going to be a ranting day? Because this is just very unusual.
Because it's a day that ends in Y.
I should record this because it gets to say, oh, wait a minute, we're already doing that. So rant away.
So somebody awesome in our organization did a blog post earlier this week and showed how to use API management as a way of taking what is normally a long-running operation, that whole thing with the 202 accepted, and put API management in front to hide that, because some clients don't want to go through that difficulty of doing all the polling stuff. And they put an API management policy in front of the long-running operation and turned it into a regular operation that you call, you wait for a while, and then you get a 200 response or a 201, whatever. And while I was looking through this particular policy just to see how it was done, something struck me. And the fact is, the way that it was dealing with the long-running operation isn't the way that I've always understood long-running operations to be done. And one of the problems is, if you look in the HP spec, it's really not very clear exactly how to do it.
Yes, I remember. I remember when we were working on Web API back in the day, and even when we were working on the book, that we started to come up with I mean, it was 202, right? Was the standard way to say, hey, you do a post, you give back an accepted, which means, hey, this is going to be running for a while. It's not going to return you an immediate result, and then you get back like a location header or URL. And it does talk, I do remember the HTTP spec does mention the idea of a status monitor.
Yes.
And, it's like post is like the Swiss Army knife of everything you can do over HTTP, which I think a lot of people don't realize. And so this concept, this idea was thrown out there as almost, but it's almost thrown out there as like a hint. It's like you then have to read that and be like, oh, and then come up with how this is actually going to work in practice.
Well, what does the status monitor look like? What is the shape?
That's what I'm saying.
Nobody knows, right?
Exactly. And I've looked, and I've seen some would say, oh, well, monitor the status monitor, and then you actually get back the resource, URL ultimately, or maybe you get back some type of report with a URL. I mean, it's
right.
It's very ambiguous.
Yes. Okay. So we know that we have a concept of a status monitor, and I actually tried defining a media type once upon a time for a status response. Of course, nobody really uses it, but whatever, right? So the thing is, how do we proceed from there, right? So we have this location header, And we know that location header points to a status monitor that is going to tell us when this long-running operation is complete. So we make a call to that location. What is the status code that you expect to get back from that?
Right. Are you asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking you.
What do I expect to get back from that status monitor? So the way
Yes.
I've always thought about it is I've expected to get back a response that would indicate to me the status. Because, for example, maybe the resource is never going to exist because of an error. So
Okay.
the status, I mean, this is just and it could be wrong. My mental model on it was, the status monitor is a resource that is going to show me the progress of the operation that is getting performed, and then it will give me a link to another resource.
Okay, let me give you two
finally
choices.
Created resource.
Would you expect to get a 200 back from the status monitor or a 202 to come back from the status monitor?
That's a great question.
So this particular example was returning a 202, and what they did was they continually did.
I always expected a 200 on the status.
Yeah. See, that's what I would expect, because I'm asking.
I expected a 200. I mean, I've seen people do other things too, where even the status monitor was like a 404, but that's kind of weird. I expect it to be a 200, and then I can keep calling it, and as part of the contract, I'll know in what I got back in the 200, like maybe there's a status code that is telling me keep polling.
Yeah.
Or something, well, I mean, like that.
Return retry after, right? So you can return a retry after header, and you wait for that amount of time, and then you call it again. You get 200, you get a retry after, you call it again. And my expectation is, if forgetting that any kind of body that we've pre-negotiated to describe the status, just using headers and status codes, you keep getting a 200 until eventually it's complete, and then I would expect like a 303, like some kind of redirect, and that redirect would point me to the completed result, right? So that's sort of how I've seen it. Now, this particular example that I saw worked against a different API or set of APIs, whose shall remain nameless.
What did you just say there? That was pretty.
Who shall remain nameless. We shall not point at people who are doing things that I don't necessarily agree with, because maybe I'm wrong. But
you changed, Daryl. First off, I've just understood that you can be wrong. It's like, and this is now, there is like evidence now.
Yes, it's recorded evidence. Okay, so when you go get a status response, a status monitor, you shouldn't get a 202, because a 202 says, yeah, I can't give you the status monitor result yet. It's a long-running operation. It's like it's a recursive thing. Every time you go and ask, well, can you give me the status? It's like, no, I can't give it you yet. I'll show you where it is later. So no, the status monitor, in my opinion, you should always return a 200 up until the point where like the operation is done. And then you either return a 200 with a body that points to the new resource, or you do a redirect. So that was part of my little rant. Two little kind of side issues moving on from that is, what happens if you have a long-running operation where you can actually return some partial information initially, but then on the back end, there's still provisioning that's going on. Can you actually return some partial information in the body of that 202? And I say, why not? Right?
Sure. Nothing about 202 says you can't return a body. It's not no content.
Yeah. And if you want, what you could do is you could include a content location header. And the content location header could tell you that for that partial response that you get back, you could say, oh, and by the way, this response, this body that I'm giving you is a partial response to this thing that's going to eventually exist over at this location identified by the content location. So that's kind of how I think you can do those long-running operations.
Yeah, so I mean, I almost feel like, do you think it was when things like status monitor are just hinted at, do you think that is like it's almost take it like a dare. Is it like a, okay, this is something you guys need to go figure out. We're not going to be prescriptive about how to do this. But the other side to me says, well, the problem when those kind of things happen, if there's no reference to point to, is everybody just goes about and does their own thing and interprets it differently. And I just wonder, like, should we be, should the API community be rising to the occasion and canonicalize, at least giving some, okay, here's one way to do it. Here's
Yeah.
another way. There may be other ways, but at least here's ways that we think satisfy the intent and the goals and the constraints and and deliver on the benefits that we believe the HTTP spec is discussing.
I think it is part of the API community's job to step up and sort of say, here's a set of common patterns that you can use to solve this particular scenario. I don't think it belongs in the spec to say this is exactly how it needs to be done.
Because I meant
in different scenarios there are different solutions. I mean, maybe it could have been a bit more prescriptive.
Well, I wasn't necessarily even saying that it should be in the core HTTP spec itself, but maybe there should be other specs that come along. Look at OAuth, right? I mean,
yeah.
That took ambiguity to a new level.
Yeah.
But others came along and kind of canonicalized.
So there's a website that I bumped into when I was looking into, like, is there any official guidance on this? There's a site called Restful Patterns, I think. And I'm going to butcher.
Should I be cringing?
No, actually, it's Cesar Potasso, I believe. One of the people who started writing that up. He was actually at the first WS REST workshop back in Raleigh in 2010. So he knows his REST. So, but yes, there's definitely, I think, the more people document these kind of common patterns, and I'm sure Subu's RESTful Cookbook will also talk about how to do this kind of stuff, right? That's why I always liked that book.
That's a great question. Yeah, I have that book. I haven't read every aspect of it, so I wonder. That's a good point. I should check and see if that's there. That would be a perfect example of something that should be there.
Yeah,
in that book.
So, moving on from my rant on long-running operations.
Yes.
And talking about HTTP patterns, I mentioned that I've actually made an effort to sort of document some of the patterns that I've used in the past.
Okay, so this is introducing the pattern of the week. We need to come up with some music, right? So we can make this like a standard thing. Be like, pattern of the week. We just did. There we go.
Pattern music. Okay, we'll work on that.
It could be like a horn or something, something.
So this wasn't picked just because it happens to alphabetically be at the beginning of my list of patterns, but I'm going to talk about the pattern that I named the alias pattern. So the alias pattern is used when you want to download a rather large amount of bytes over the wire. You're downloading a video, you're downloading an audio file or something, but you don't necessarily want to download it from your particular API. You want to actually use it, get those bytes from some other location, either some kind of cloud blobs file storage or a CDN or something like that. But you want to present the URI as something that lives naturally within your own URI space of your API. So basically, you use a redirect. You create the notion of a resource identifier in your API.
You're like a
301. That is its alias. Yeah. And well, that's the question. So I suggested to use the 307 temporary redirect.
Redirect, yeah.
And so somebody would make a request to your API, so podcast number 1, but then it goes off to some secondary location, maybe YouTube or some my CDN storage, and retrieves it.
I just want to interject for another call. I think those 300 status codes, a lot of them are not well understood. It might be worth in one of our calls just going through them.
Yep.
And Because I know, like, when I first read them, and sometimes it's just like overwhelming. It's like, what the heck is the difference between this one and this one and this one? So, particularly related to these redirects and temporarily moved and all of that, maybe for the next episode, let's plan
Yep.
to have a little bit
Absolutely.
of a segue into that.
Perfect. So, I mean, there isn't really much to say about it other than the fact that, you know, you can cache that redirects. Sometimes people don't realize that you can cache redirects. You can also, if you used 308, which is the new permanent redirect, then somebody could actually store that as kind of a local bookmark. So if you're ever trying to go and get that in the future, you can use that permanent redirect rather than doing the extra hop to make one request and then it redirecting you to a second.
So by caching, just to clarify for everybody that's here, you mean that, like, if there was a proxy in front, for example,
yes, an HTTP proxy,
it could cache, and you could actually return cache headers as well. Well, it would honor those cache headers.
Yes, so if you have an intermediary cache,
go refetch and get the latest updated version of the resource.
Yep, just cache control, max age.
And then clients would, like your browser cache, could also do this. Like if the proxy didn't, whether the proxy did it or not, the browser could also cache that locally.
Yes,
which is part of the beauty of when you follow the rules of HTTP. You get these magic benefits.
You get stuff for free. Absolutely.
Which you surprisingly don't when you violate those rules.
You tunnel everything over WebSockets. You're starting from scratch and reinventing the world. Not that there's not sometimes where you might want to do that. So, okay, so there's pattern of the week. I figured we'd start out with something very nice and simple. I'll include a link. I'll post a link on the Twitter to that particular patterns page, and maybe I'll pick something a little bit more adventurous for next week. In 2 weeks.
Well, let's just read it back just to make sure I'm understanding it. So this alias pattern, what you're saying is that I want to basically have a nice, friendly name on my site for accessing a resource that is somewhere else. That could be another resource on my site, or generally it would be an external resource, because you can use things like web servers and things like that to do local kind of aliasing where, you wouldn't necessarily even need to have a redirect. Like if you use something like Nginx, you can create aliases. I don't know if you know this, but like with Nginx, you can create aliases. I'll give you a perfect example of where we've done this, which is not one that is done through, I don't know if it's actually just doing a redirect and it's allowing you to just specify metadata to do it. It might be. But to give you an example, we have like our blog at Auth0, and we have Nginx in front of that, in front of our website, which is where our blog lives. And I've posted blog posts where we found out after we posted that the tweet was wrong. The tweet which we didn't want to delete was like had underscores and the blog post had dashes or something like that. So we basically deployed an Nginx rule, and like for like 10 minutes that tweet was like not working. Like the link you would click on the tweet would send you to 404. This happened to me actually, and it was my fault, like the naming and the tweet.
So basically a rewrite rule, right, is what you're saying? You're saying the incoming URL, we're going to rewrite it to something else on the back end.
Yes. Which is a little bit different, right? Because that's not quite the same, because it's just going to route it to a different
right, and
but it's not necessarily going to hit into a true redirect. It's not going to give like a 301 or something like that.
Right, and it doesn't address one of the issues, which was perhaps you are billed by bandwidth from that API, or there are some other constraints with regards to bandwidth on that API, and you don't want the client to actually retrieve the bytes from the target, target API.
The origin.
You want it to go directly to the CDN. And it also allows that kind of change over time, right? Oh, we're using this CDN this week, and then we found we could get a better deal with this other CDN, and we moved it.
I see. So you're location transparency through an area that you control, where the result or where they finally get redirected to is completely in your control.
Yep.
Got it. Great. Really cool. Looking forward to more patterns.
Okay,
So.
excellent. Very, very good. So, wanted to talk a little bit about one of the reasons why I've been busy this week. Yesterday, we announced that a project that I've been kind of working on for a while, which is a parsing library for .NET for OpenAPI, formerly known as Swagger. I have to add that in. Apparently, Jeremy Miller.
How long do you have to add that in for? Do you have like is there like, some type of end of life of using that term?
I think it's going to be ever. Apparently, Jeremy Miller posted a blog post last night, which he tweeted to me saying specifically he used Swagger everywhere just to annoy me. So
Jeremy can do that.
My efforts are somewhat backfiring, but anyway. Yes, so it's a open source project, MIT licensed, sitting on GitHub. It's under the Microsoft organization called OpenAPI.NET. It is a .NET standard library, so it will run on all platforms that .NET will run on. All that .NET Standard 2.0 will run on. And it supports both reading and writing YAML and JSON formatted, and it also supports V2 and V3. So what that means is you can read in a V2 document and it will upgrade it to a V3. You could, even if you want to work with V3 because you like the syntax better, as long as you don't use any of the really new features that aren't supported in V2, you could write stuff in V2 and then downcast it. So you can write it in V3, edit it in YAML V3, and then downcast it to JSON V2 because the tools that you're happening to use to generate documentation expect it to be in V2 JSON. So it's been quite an interesting project just in its orchestration, because I actually started off a project that was I did under my own org on GitHub, and I got part way there, and then I bumped into some other teams within Microsoft that were doing similar things with slightly different purposes, but there was a lot of overlap. So we kind of banded together and said, how about we work on this as a single thing, and we'll just create a single core object model and set of writers, and then different teams are producing different different readers to consume different types of content in order to fill that model. So yes, it's been an interesting experiment working in what they like to call a V team at Microsoft, a virtual team.
Does it support .NET Standard? What's the?
Yeah, it's .NET Standard 2.
2? Yeah.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, well, let's make sure to share the link on that. And one idea I had, because we're just learning as we go, is, we actually can screen share. So we don't have to do this now. But, in the future, when we bring up a cool library, if there's like a repo, we can just show that repo and just talk about, talk about some of the things that are there. Or if there's samples that are, a lot of times repos will have samples on the README. So we can actually do that.
So one interesting thing, so the repo is up there, but there's no NuGet package yet. And the reason there's no NuGet package is interesting because NuGet recently introduced this security where they're securing namespaces so that people can't kind of post fake packages with
say they're Microsoft or
confusing names. Yeah, so because this is under it's Microsoft.OpenAPI, we had to go through this internal process of registering that we own that namespace, and otherwise NuGet won't let us push to that namespace. So it's an interesting new security addition that they've added to NuGet.
Yeah, one of the things I still miss about NuGet, which I think Packet addressed this, is like in the Node world, I can actually install a Node module from a repo. I can specify the GitHub URL, specify the branch, and that gets installed. NuGet, it would be a bit more complicated in the sense that, well, no, actually, no. Yeah, because if you just had a repo with no binaries, that would have to get built. Whereas in the Node world, as long as you're not a native module, there's no building. That being said, and I was really happy when I saw, I mean, Packet goes even further because it lets you go and get individual files. But anyway, this has nothing to do with APIs, but it would be nice if we could do that.
So what sort of does have something to do more generically and not focused on any technology is the interesting dynamic when, so the Microsoft project was kind of developed in a private GitHub repo, and it got to this point of, so when are we going to actually make this public? And there was a kind of a, well, let's get it right, let's sort it, let's deal with all the issues, and let's fix everything. And I kind of pushed for the, no, let's not fix everything, let's get it out as soon as possible, because there are other community people who would like to build on top of this stuff, and they'd probably like to be able to give feedback. And it's an interesting question, like if you have this kind of open source project that is being built within an org, at what point is the right point to make it visible to the world? I think there's pros and cons to both sides of that story.
You'll definitely get me to rant if you on this topic, but no, I mean, it's a, you know, I've ran several open source projects, including ones that we were building internally. When I was at Microsoft, when I was at Splunk, at Auth0, we do a lot of open source projects, and a lot of stuff that we contribute to open source, and we open it up usually. We have a default experience of opening things up. There are some things we keep closed, but one thing I would say is, you know, so there, I think the value of that, if you go away from open source libraries, hold on 1 second.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to do a little singing and a dancing while Glenn deals with berries.
Yeah, I'm not in the room I'm normally in, so I'm trying to make sure it's quiet. Quiet! So you know, this concept of fail fast, I think, is really important, which is, you know, and getting rapid feedback. So the advantage of getting things out there is the quicker you get them out there, the more people are going to use them, the more feedback you're going to get. And it's so much easier to address things early on when they're small. Because what happens is you start to make decisions based on decisions, and sometimes the first decision is actually wrong. And you would have known that had you gotten it out there soon. You made an assertion, and based on that, or assumption, and based on that assumption, and we know about assume, want to be careful with assumptions. So one thing I think is really interesting too. Like when I was at Splunk, I was really excited, like when MyGet came on the scene, because we put our source out there. And, you know, again, in the NuGet world, you don't have that easy path to just install it from source without bringing it down and building it. You can't, like, point directly to that. But with MyGet, you can basically have, like, pointing to a dev branch, a feed, and anybody can go into Visual Studio or whatever their editor of choice is and add that feed, and then they can get a much nicer experience because, you know, MyGet has CI. So it will, like, every time stuff gets pulled to the dev branch, it will build it. So when I was at Splunk and we were working on our new C# SDKs, we decided to say, hey, like, let's use MyGet. Let's have a master branch and a dev branch. The dev branch also works as an advantage that later, you know, having the dev feed is helpful too later on when you're doing fixes for customers and you want to provide an easy way for them to just grab it. Wow, you froze there for a second.
I did?
Well, I think you just were, like, standing and listening, but for a second I lost you. Anyway, I'm a big fan of getting things out there, and even if you look at the whole spec process, like the whole idea of, like, HTTP specs now, people are starting to actually, like, start them off on GitHub.
Yeah.
So that it's just a much lighter weight way to iterate. And even when Mike was doing collection JSON, I loved the idea. Well, he still is, still there. And, you know, he's really pushed on this idea that, like, you can have extensions to the protocol, and you just go to GitHub and, you know, create a page and start a conversation. So yeah. I'm a big fan of that. Get it out there, iterate, and, you know, I guess the exception to the rule is sometimes you have some serious IP, and you have to be careful there. But I think that should be the exception. That's generally the exception to the rule.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm definitely a fan of getting the community involved as soon as possible because there's a lot of smart people there with a lot of great ideas. So there's always that fear though of people are just going to come and start saying, "Oh, this is no good. This doesn't do this and it doesn't do that." But usually with
Yeah, but that
with
fear, I
careful
think, is.
community management, you can overcome those
But
things.
I'm sorry, but that's BS because it's like that fear is even more intensified if you wait
Yeah,
and then suddenly just go out the door, because that means that you've like spent a lot more time baking this thing in your echo chamber
yeah,
without actually, I mean, it's if you really care about that, get it out there sooner.
yeah,
Because
yeah,
it's like, even if somebody doesn't like something, and yeah, people are very vocal and they'll let you know that, it's like they're going to let you know that as early as possible so you don't go further down the deep end, versus if you made an assumption and you're like, yep, let's go forward on that. And I can name, well, let's look at Entity Framework, right? V1. I mean, that's a great example in the net world of where there were a bunch of assumptions that were made, and that project went on for a long time. And by the time people started to give the feedback, it's like this thing was already fully baked, and people would just be like, I absolutely hate this.
yeah,
This is just like wrong in like 50 different ways instead of just like one.
yeah, yeah,
Sorry to
yeah,
pick on the Entity Framework.
yeah, yeah. So yes, so there you go. That's been part of my week there.
So where did
We're
that end up?
well, it's
As far
out.
as out. Oh, so you won that. You won that. You won
It's
that.
I mean, there's still like some. We still have a big chunk of the validation mechanisms to build in there. I want to build in pluggable extension models, which isn't there. We currently don't support references to external files because that actually turns out to be that's quite a bit more complex than I thought it was going to be. References to things internal in the same file aren't too bad. But references to external files open up a whole slew of issues. And it's been interesting. I've been reading some of the GitHub issues on the JSON schema work that's going on, and they're having the same thing because you can reference other JSON schemas. And as soon as you get into this question of, well, I have a draft 7 schema that's referring to another document that is a draft 4 version of the schema. Is that allowed? And how do you reconcile the fact that you've got this blend of different versions of the schema all working together to try and do validation on a single object? And we have the same issue in OpenAPI. Can you take an OpenAPI v3 document and reference elements from a v2 document? So anyway, that kind of work still needs to be done, and trying to figure out how to build an object model correctly to handle those external references, because most of the model is synchronous, right? But then as soon as you start pointing to external files, you want to do it async, so you can't really do it lazy loading. Anyway, ton of different questions. Love to get people's feedback on that.
Yeah, the only other thing I'd recommend, and I haven't looked at the repo yet, is put stuff in a branch or a dev branch. That also sets branches are a great way to set expectation, right? You have the master branch and you have like the dev branch, and developers understand what these different things mean.
Yeah.
And this way, it's like, hey, anything we put in dev might even go away. Like we're not,
right.
But it's there for you to try out. And this is where, again, going back to what I was saying for .NET with MyGet, I'd recommend, look at that, because with MyGet, you can have a dev feed. And then it's like the people, you're facilitating it that people can get going with it without having to build it themselves.
Yep.
They can use the tools that they know, but you're also making it clear from an expectations perspective that, hey, this is not baked yet.
Yep.
We just want to make it easier for you to get feedback. And then for the people that want the thing that's stable, well, they just go and get the thing from the master branch. And it's like, even if you haven't fully published it to NuGet, again, you can still use MyGet and be like, hey, I have a master branch, and those are the things we're saying is more stable. Or you can even add a stable branch. I mean, branches are cheap.
Yeah.
And MyGet will let you use whatever branches you want. So end of rant there.
Cool. Good feedback. So I want to end up on one extra little piece of information that I thought was kind of cool. In the Mood for HTTP Twitter account, I posted a link to an article written by Mark Nottingham, who's the chair of the HTTP Working Group, and he was basically kind of surveying the landscape of internet protocols and where things need to go over the coming years. And one of the things that he mentioned that is being worked on is what which I thought was an awesome name, is called DOH, DOH, which is DNS over HTTP.
That's hilarious. Is that going to have like the Bart Simpson, you know, Homer Simpson is going to be the image for that protocol?
For the replacement of DNS. So part of the reasoning, I believe, and I've only kind of skimmed this at a fairly high level, is this whole problem with being able to spoof DNSs, you know, getting in and being able to change a host name, like lots of malware will, or your host file that malware will do, or even if when you're on a captive network, or your ISP will go and mess around with DNS and start pointing you to things that aren't what you think they are, because the DNS has been updated. And the idea here is if you can do DNS over HTTP, or more specifically over HTTPS, then a ISP would not be able to block access. For the example that they give in the document is, well, what happens if Google all of a sudden started to provide DNS services at www.google.com, then in order to prevent you from accessing that official DNS server that's there, or DNS service that's there, they'd actually have to block www.google.com, which obviously nobody's going to accept.
Sure.
So by being able to piggyback the DNS services on these HTTPS host names, then nobody can get in between you and a valid set of DNS services.
Because of SSL, because of the SSL.
Yes. Yeah, and because your ISP can't tell whether or not you're doing a search on the Google search engine, or whether you're doing a DNS lookup.
Sure.
So it can't mess around with those kind of things.
Didn't you have a JWT question? Because I actually did get an answer.
Have a JWT question. Ran into this morning with, I had one of our customer support reps from Romania pinged me and said, this customer's unhappy because their JOT token isn't validating because they're not providing an issuer claim, ISS claim.
Yep.
And I kind of said, well, isn't ISS a required thing? I mean, come on, shouldn't you have to know where it's been issued from? But the spec says it's optional. And my question is, why is it optional? Under what scenarios is that valid?
Yes. So fortunately, we have a couple of experts around JWT at Auth0. We care a lot about JWT. And so I talked to them because, if it's not known yet, let me just let the cat out of the bag. I am not the security expert at Auth0. I know enough to be dangerous. But a person who is Jared Hansen, who's the creator of Passport.js, and we are super fortunate to have him work for us. He always blows my brain. So I asked him this. And so basically it comes down to two things. So from the JWT perspective itself, the issuer claim, ISS, is optional. It is, and pretty much most things with JWT, it's a data structure. And, as is common, it is common that these kind of data structures have most things actually being optional.
Okay.
But so if you look into the JWT spec, it actually is listed as optional. However, if you're using tokens that have claims, like for OpenID Connect, the issuer is non-optional. So if you look at the OpenID spec, it's non-optional. So when I talked with, so I'll send you a link to that. So, and again, this is me just echoing my awesome coworker who gave me this information. So, what's happening is JWT, again, it's a data structure, can be used for many different purposes that don't invalidate it as a JWT. As a matter of fact, we've done this within Webtask. We've used JWTs in various different fashions, and those are fine. The main thing is if the JWT carries claims, is what Jared said. If it's carrying claims, then it should have an issuer. And again, as we mentioned, if you're doing OpenID Connect, they have to have it. It is so you have these multiple levels of specifications that are going on here. So
Yep.
I think the answer is, if it's in the context of OpenID Connect or there's claims, yes, it should. Well, yeah, it's non-optional. Does that help?
That is perfect. That's exactly what I wanted to know. It's good to have resources like you around, Glenn, that I can ask and you can ask somebody else.
Exactly. I was just going to say, I only take credit for being able to ask a question to the right person and being able to give the answer.
Isn't that what it's all about, though?
No, of course, now I can go and, submit a talk on why you should have the issuer claim in JWT or not.
So that seems to be wrapping up the time that we have for today. We will probably not be back in 2 weeks unless you really want to do another episode over the Christmas break.
Over the break, yeah, probably. Yeah. I think we'll probably skip that.
We'll take a break during the break. Sounds like a good plan.
Yes. I do want to mention one thing. We do have a blog that is coming on Medium where we are planning to do micro posts for each episode. And I take blame that we have the blog, but we've not put any posts there yet. So I'm planning to post all the episodes there, and that's where you'll be able to go. And then Daryl still has a mini project.
I still have the RSS feed
for iTunes
to make work in iTunes.
Yes, so we have 2 little works in progress. Maybe that's what we'll work on over the holidays.
That's right.
Those things are done. I actually like the sound of that. Yes, we're not going to be ready till after the holiday, so we can get those things done.
And I will continue posting little gems of information that I find on the In the Mood for HTTP Twitter handle. So keep following that, and maybe we'll all learn something together.
Awesome. Okay, everybody have a great holiday and New Year. And,
Indeed.
Good as always.
Thanks, Glenn.